So the key to making your action camera footage go from looking like this to looking like this is all in the settings in the camera. This is one of the most common questions I get, and it occurred to me it has been 6 years since I last made a video talking about how I set up my action camera. So today we're gonna dive into it. We have a lot to get into, so we're gonna break it down into two categories: easy mode and hard mode. All right, so we're gonna start with, you guessed it, easy mode. This is the Insta360 Ace Pro 2. By the way, sponsoring this video, we're gonna use this camera to kind of go through the settings and show you guys exactly how I set it up. And easy mode, as you'll notice, doesn't require any special accessories. This is exactly how the camera comes out of the box. So we're gonna fire it up. And these are the typical settings you see when you get a new action camera. So the first thing you'll notice is we're at 4K 60. We don't want that. We want 4K 24. Now don't worry if your camera isn't capable of shooting in higher resolution. 2.7K is fine. And what I don't want to do is go up to 8K. Even though that's an option on this camera, what it does, like you just saw, is it punches in the field of view. We're going to talk about the field of view in a second. But it uses so much data. It uses the battery quickly. 24 is the way to go for a variety of reasons. I would stick with that. And while we're on the subject of resolution and stabilization, I like to keep it at standard. Again, high stabilization, generally, the way it works is it crops in a little bit more. Should we talk for a second? Actually, we're going to save that for a later section about how stabilization works. For now, keep that on standard. Trust me, standard's the way to go. So I think that's good now for resolution. Let's come over to the field of view. Linear is cool because it doesn't have any distortion, but you really want that wide angle for that really immersive looking GoPro / action camera footage. It's like a GoPro look is what people refer to it as. So we're gonna put that to action, which on the Insta360 is the widest field of view. Look at that difference. That's what we're looking for. So we're gonna put that on action, which is super wide. We are gonna change our settings to manual and standard color. That's fine. I'm okay with standard color. I don't want log footage because this is easy mode. I want to set my shutter to auto. That's going to make our lives so much easier in this simple setting. ISO, okay. This we're going to take a detour to Nerdville for a second. What you should do if you have gotten a new action camera is find out what your tolerance is for ISO settings, because every camera is going to be a little bit different. This one has a very large sensor, so it's going to take in more light. It's going to do a lot better in low light settings, and also it's going to do a lot better processing because of the chip that's inside of higher ISOs. But what I've done with this camera, for example, is I have done the same recording at ISO 100, 200, 400, 800, all the way up to its maximum value of 6400. The ISO, in case you don't know, is how sensitive the sensor is behind the lens here at taking in light. And the problem with bumping up the ISO to a really high setting is it introduces noise and gain in the image, which distorts the color and kind of gives it this washed out digital look, which isn't generally desirable. So you want to keep that as low as possible. Now, if we're gonna venture off to Dorktown and look at the test I've done, if you look on the screen right now, you'll notice all of these same frames of reference with the same settings except for the ISO has been cranked up. To my eye, the image starts to break down on this particular camera at ISO 1600. Anything beyond that, it starts to fall apart. Now, this is a zoomed in view. This is a pixel peeping. This is like a really exaggerated view of what high ISO does. Under normal circumstances, you're outside riding your bike in the daytime, you can get away with lower ISO. So in this case, on this camera, I would set the maximum ISO to 800, which is what I've done here, maximum ISO 800. On other cameras, for example, the GoPro, which has a much smaller sensor, you can see comparing the 6400 ISO to this Insta360, There's no comparison. The GoPro is doing a much worse job in low light situations at really high ISO. So you might want to do this test yourself on your camera. But anyway, we're coming back from Dorktown, and we're going to set, in this simple setting, we're going to set the ISO max to 800 on this camera. And what else do we have to look at here? White balance. Now, if you really want the simplest settings possible, just set the white balance to auto, and that'll be fine. The problem with that is, without getting too off into the weeds here, is the camera's going to be constantly trying to adjust the white balance, in other words, the color temperature, to account for things like changing of the sun angle, or if you're going through shade or something like that. And that's not really natural. That's not really how our eyes work. I mean, if you're out riding in the middle of the day, it's much more of a bluer tint. And then as the sun sets, you know, it's warm, it's golden, there's a glow. I want to capture that. That looks natural to me. So if you set your your white balance to manual, and you're out riding in the middle of the day, what you need to know is midday sunshine is 5,600 Kelvin. So if you set it there, and you're out riding in the middle of the day, it's going to look great. And then as the sun sets, if you're doing a longer ride, for example, it's going to adjust accordingly. It's going to look much more natural. But if you don't want to fuss with any of that, just set the white balance to auto. And I like to change the sharpness to low because I feel like these action cameras generally over-sharpen things. And other than that, that is all the settings right there that we are going to do for the easy mode. And if you've done it right, this is what it ends up looking like. This is perfectly adequate footage. This looks fine. The problem is it's missing something, right? It's missing that feeling of action. And if you pop over to the hard mode, you'll notice that the biggest difference comes down to this motion blur, which is especially prevalent in the corners of the frame. This is what tells our brain that we're moving fast. Without that, if we pop back over to the easy mode footage, it's hard to distinguish this frame, which we're going like 25 miles an hour here, but if I just pause the frame, you would never know it. It looks like I'm just sitting here on my bike going 0 miles an hour. Again, popping over to the hard mode settings, which we're gonna get into in a second, this screams speed. This exudes motion, and this gives us that feeling of cinematic high-speed action, which is what you want from your action camera. So let's dive into the hard mode settings. I'm going to try to keep this as simple and easy to understand as possible. So we're going to start with the easy stuff here, and most settings are actually the same. 4K 24, standard stabilization, all that remains the same. Action, field of view, the widest we can get, that stays the same. And standard color profile, same max ISO, white balance. If you're going to go into hard mode, we're actually now going to set this to 5600. Low sharpening, all of this is the same except for this one setting, and that is the shutter speed. That dictates the motion blur in the frame, and we have to manipulate the shutter speed in order to get this desired effect. So there's a principle in videography that says your shutter speed should be half of your frame rate. So if we are shooting at 24 frames per second, we want to have a shutter speed that is 1/50th of a second. That is going to give the most natural looking motion blur. So you might be thinking, easy, I'll just pop it over to a 50th of a second manual and we're good to go. Wrong. As you can tell from this footage, something's missing, right? This is where it gets complicated, you guys. The problem is stabilization. Lowering the shutter speed messes with the stabilization of the camera. As you can see in this footage, things just look awful. This is because the way stabilization works in action cameras is it takes individual frames, one frame before, one frame after, it determines the offset, and it corrects each frame to create a smooth and stable video. That's how you get that really clean looking stabilization. This is all happening, by the way, at 24 times per second, sometimes even 120 times per second if you have a higher frame rate. Crazy how good this technology is, but the problem is it requires a stable frame on either side to measure that offset. And by definition, motion blur is not a stable frame. So the stabilization engine inside the camera gets wonky and it can't figure out how to measure that offset. And yeah, you have good looking motion blur, but the whole stabilization is gone. And this is the dilemma. You want motion blur for cinematic footage, but motion blur results in unstable footage, which isn't cinematic. So it's possible to have both, but it's a little tricky. So let's break this down. So the easiest way to solve this dilemma is by using a thing called a gimbal. I have one here, which is for obviously a much larger camera. It stabilizes the footage in all three axes physically, so you don't have to worry about stabilization. Now, of course, action camera ones are much smaller, but I wouldn't be caught dead wearing one of those in a long ride, let alone a race, so that's out of the question. FYI, that's how Safa Brian, if you guys know that YouTube channel, which is really cool, go check it out if you haven't, that's how he gets really stable footage on his descents. He uses a physical gimbal during his crazy descents. But we're not doing that in a race. Instead, we need to consider what type of riding we're going to be doing and how much stabilization we're actually going to need. So let's set up a hypothetical scenario. Say you're mounting the camera on your handlebars, you're doing a crit on bumpy roads or a gravel race. First of all, bike-mounted cameras always experience more bumps than helmet or chest mounts. Pair that with a bumpy road, and you're gonna need a ton of stabilization in order to get usable footage. So in this scenario, I would set my shutter speed to 1/200th of a second. You're gonna get some motion blur, but most importantly, you're gonna get stable footage. So let's look at a second scenario. Let's say that you're putting on a chest mount for a very long descent on freshly paved roads. First of all, descents don't require pedaling, so inherently there's going to be less camera motion. Chest mounts use your body as a natural shock absorber, which means less camera motion. Finally, freshly paved roads means less road chatter, which means less camera motion. So, as you can see in this situation, you don't really need much stabilization, so you can maximize that motion blur, and you can get away with a much lower shutter speed. In this scenario, I would set my shutter speed to a 60th of a second. And then everything is pretty much gonna fall between these two extremes. A 200th of a second means less motion blur, but really good stabilization. A 60th of a second shutter speed means really good motion blur, but not great stabilization. You have to think about the type of riding you're doing. I generally set things at 100th of a second. And just to give you a concept of what each of these looks like, here is a 60th of a second shutter speed. Here's an 80th. Here's a 100th of a second shutter speed, which is kind of my go-to standard. You can get away with 120th too, that's what that looks like. And this is 160th of a second. This is where you're gonna start to notice slightly less motion blur, and you're gonna start using these settings for, bad roads, gravel, that sort of thing. A 200th of a second, the roads are getting worse, the stabilization is getting better. And if we go any higher, you'll notice that the motion blur is almost gone, but we have to push the shutter speed to these higher rates in order to get the stabilization to get usable footage. Okay, so you've gotten this far in the video, you've set your camera up to everything I've talked about, and you're gonna go outside and you're gonna take some footage. And at 100th of a second shutter speed, your footage looks like this. It's crappy, it's blown out, it's unusable. What are we missing here? That is this right here. These are called neutral density filters. They're basically like little sunglasses for your camera. Because the problem is, when you lower the shutter speed on your action camera, you're letting too much light in to hit the sensor, and all of the details are blown out, and it's way overexposed. So this is where everything comes together. If you've decided that you're gonna shoot 100th of a second on a normal sunny day, clear, you're probably gonna want an ND16. This is the set that comes with the Ace Pro 2. This is the ND16. But if you are doing that descent we talked about, and then you want an even lower shutter speed, let's say a 60th of a second, you might spring for this ND32, because the lower the shutter speed, the more light is coming in to hit the sensor. The opposite is true, right? If it's a cloudy day, it's overcast. If it's later in the day, there's just not much sun poking through, you're gonna want something like this ND8. And then, if it's twilight crit, you might want this polarizer. This is like the ultimate set. I recommend getting something like this because it has everything you need. It might be the case that you don't want to put any filter on your camera. It might want to just look like this if you're doing like a twilight crit. All of those Intelligentsia races, I got really clean, good-looking motion blur and stabilization with no filtration on the front. So these are super simple, by the way. You just push them on here. I'm gonna go outside and show you guys a couple of examples of what this looks like. Okay, so here we are outside. So it's a little bit meta. We're taking a video of a video. My neighbors must think I'm crazy. But I wanna show you guys exactly how I set up the camera here because I think this is really important. Let's say I want to go out and I want to shoot a descent and The roads are pretty good. We're going to be doing it at an 80th of a second, let's say. Now I want to show you what this footage looks like. So now we're going to start recording here at an 80th of a second. All the other settings are the same. And see what I mean? That is way too bright. Especially, I mean, I'm in the shade. Once I get out into the sun, like that is, that's bad looking footage. So we need a filter. Okay, so we need a filter, right? So I'm gonna open up my case here. This is exactly what I do when I'm trying to figure out which filter to use. I'm looking at the angle of the sun. It's still pretty high in the sky. And if we're doing less than 100, I think I'm gonna need that ND32. There it is. I'm gonna put that on. And now check out the difference. If we go and we look at that same frame a second ago, now we have motion blur, but we're not completely blown out. This looks like a well-exposed image. And to drive the point home, let's just try one more example to show you guys what I'm talking about. Let's say that we are gonna go do a race and they are really bad roads. Let's say we need to go all the way up to a 1/60th of a second. So we're gonna set that in the camera and we're gonna see how that looks. Now I'm recording on the Insta360 with no filter. And you can see it is still way too bright. This is an unusable image. So we're gonna come back to our filters here. I'm putting the 32 away. Because we have a higher shutter speed, we can get away with using the ND16, maybe even the 8. There's the 16. Let's go see what that looks like back in the sun. And that looks good. I would put on the 16 in this case. And we know that we have a low ISO, we have the proper shutter speed, we have a little bit of motion blur, but most importantly, I'm shaking the camera now, you probably can't even tell, we have stable footage. Okay, so just to wrap things up, easy mode, if you get the settings right, should look like this. And hard mode, but worth it mode, if you get the settings right, should look like this. I hope this video helps. I don't know, I get a little rambly. It's a complex topic. Action cameras are very hard to get right. I'm hoping this video helps you guys get more cinematic looking footage out of your action camera. Again, I want to thank Insta360 for sponsoring this video. If you want to learn more about this specific camera, the Ace Pro 2, I'll leave a link in the description. So thanks for hanging in there, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.